Great conversation in the room. Great opportunity to connect. And now we'll move into a really interesting next section of our program. So, as we're thinking about economic strategy and putting something together to guide economic development for the next decade, one thing we really focused on was the megatrends coming down the pike that will shape the state's economy. We're not just years ahead, but decades ahead. No surprise, the one trend we heard a lot about was the accelerating pace of innovation. Technologies that were once science fiction, Star Trek, Star Wars, decades ago talking about are now they're consumerized and part of real life. We're talking about artificial intelligence, digital manufacturing, 3D printing, which I still don't understand how that works, but it's amazing, right? Big data, they've all arrived. They've arrived on a scene faster than I think any of us expected or were ready for. But these technologies promote huge opportunities for businesses, governments, people, but also big challenges. The next 4 sessions will shed some light on the technologies driving new opportunities and challenges for our economy and our society and what they mean for us in Oregon. Up first, we'll hear from Lama Nachman, Director of Intel's Artificial Intelligence Lab, who will share some expert perspective on the question of where's artificial intelligence leading us? Following Lama, we'll hear from HP's Chief Technology Officer and Head of Global Labs, Shane Wall, about the future of manufacturing. Shane is responsible for driving the company's technology vision and strategy and new business incubation and the overall technical and innovation community. I had a chance to hear him speak a few months ago. You will not want to miss that. Then we'll have Dr. Danny Jacobs, President of Oregon Health and Sciences University, up on stage to tell us why and how Oregon can be a leader at the intersection of big data, health, and healthcare. A lot of conversation about healthcare earlier, a lot of conversation about data looking ahead. How do we bring those together? We'll wrap this portion of the program by having a panel reflect on perhaps the most pressing question emerging from the ascent of these technologies. So what's it mean for the future of work and learning? Pretty common theme from this morning. How does all this wrap up together? For that panel, we'll be having Stefan Bird, CEO of Pacific Power, and chair of the CTE STEM Employer Coalition, and a set of students and educators. But first up, please join me in welcoming to the stage Lama Nachman to give her presentation.
Good morning. So if it happens at Intel, it happens first in Oregon. I'm sure that our CEO does not mind me stealing his line. We actually go a long way here and have very deep connections with Oregon at Intel. So our relationship started in 1945. We have more than 20,000 employees today in this region, and we invest heavily in R&D. So I'm extremely excited to be here and talk to all of you. I want to start with trying to change the narrative a little bit and go from this notion of a future of AI, where it's focused on human-AI competition, to actually a notion where it's more about human-AI collaboration. So rather than thinking of this as a zero-sum game, where one has to win and one has to lose, can we start to think about this as a way to bring the best of humans and AI to actually change society for the better, right? To bring about prosperity, to actually, most importantly, create inclusive economies. So I'll start with some examples of where we see a lot of potential in this space. Talk about what do we really need to do to invest in these type of technologies, and then close with some thoughts about ethics and how do we create responsible technologies. So to begin with, if you think about the aging population more generally, right? We know from a lot of the ethnographic research that there is a huge pressure for the aging population to go into assisted living. And that's for a good reason, right? So we're concerned about their well-being, we're concerned about accidents, we're concerned about medication, we're concerned about all sorts of things. However, we also know from the research that once we do this, we end up actually seeing much worse outcomes, right? People deteriorate very quickly as they go into these homes. So now the question is, how can we bring AI to the table so that we can actually start to actually look over our loved ones, our aging population, in their own homes? So we can understand that they're actually going about their normal activities, doing the things that we expect them to do, connecting with their loved ones and friends, and just, that there hasn't really been a strange shift in that behavior. And not only does that help us, make sure that everything is okay and intervene when there's a problem, but one of the interesting things that we've noticed is that there is then a shift in the conversations that happen. So rather than the conversations with your loved ones being about an interrogation, did you take your medication? Did you do this? Did you do that? It actually brings back, by being empowered with that data, that opportunity to actually create that human connection in the way that it actually helps. Another area that I want to touch on is manufacturing, and I'm sure Shane is going to talk quite a bit about that. But one of the things that we know is that there has been quite a bit of automation. And if you look at it today in many of our fabrication facilities and manufacturing facilities all over the world, you actually still see humans. And you see humans, even though maybe their role has changed within those facilities, because humans bring something different to the table, right? They bring an ability to connect the dots, to learn from very limited data, to actually make connections of things that they haven't seen before, and to diagnose things and issues more deeply. But if you think about it, if actually AI is able to actually see what's going on and help people where they need help, recognize from what needs to be done in terms of tasks and supporting the human where we forget, where we make sometimes mistakes, but also facilitate for people to learn from each other. Because as you're watching over all of these different people who are doing these different activities, you could start to see where people actually deviate, and you can start to bring some learning across these. A third area that I want to mention is education. And this is probably one of my pet peeves here. It's like, if you think about education, it is really ripe for a major disruption, right? Because we know that kids and humans in general learn very differently. Yet, we're hell-bent on having one system that treats everybody the same. And that doesn't really work. So then, we also know from the ethnographic research there that better engagement translates to better outcomes. So then the question becomes, how can technology enable understanding of the engagement of the learner, and then use that information to help personalize that learning experience? And that isn't about taking the teacher out of the loop. This is really about empowering the teacher in all of the settings that we know are challenging, and especially when you actually start to even have content that's delivered to kids and so on, to be able to understand that level of engagement, to be able to tailor or focus their help on where it's actually needed. So we know that you're able to actually get a lot of insight into engagement from all sorts of inputs that are there, right? From the camera, from how people are engaged with the content platform, what they're actually focused on, even physiology in that sense. So how can we actually utilize a lot of that learning to help both the teacher be empowered, but also enable the content platform to actually personalize that content? And then, I'm sure you're all, as parents, concerned about screen time. And this is something that we see a lot in our ethnographic research. So, on one hand, parents want to leverage a lot of what technology brings, but rightfully so, they're concerned about screen time. So one of the interesting areas to start to think about is, can we actually think about the learning environment as the third teacher? Just in the same way that the Reggio Emilia approach, for example, does, right? Can we actually start to think about how do we enable kids to interact with objects in the environment, to have a learning agent that is actually inhabiting that physical environment, where they can start to actually learn math and literacy and all of that in that environment. But that means that agent needs to be able to see what's going on, to actually help the kids, but also be able to interact with them, because they don't really speak the way we speak with Alexa, clearly. Another area that's really very dear to my heart is specifically focusing on people with disabilities. And if you think about it today, I mean, one of the projects that actually dearest to my heart is the work that we've done with Professor Stephen Hawking over almost 9 years. And the idea there is, if you're actually enabling people to access their computer with very limited input. So in the case of Stephen, it was just a move of his cheek, but for other people, it might be brain-computer interface, that you're able to actually help them be much more independent and engage in the society in very different ways, and especially given that today, the physical world and the digital world are very connected, right? So once you make that link, it makes a huge difference. But it's also important to start to think about, how can AI anticipate what people might want, right? How do we reduce the burden of the interaction? How do we reduce the silence that happens when somebody's communicating with you and you're going about trying to communicate back and it's taking forever? Instead, can AI actually start to anticipate what the person might want to communicate based on what it's hearing, and then enable the person to judge that outcome in a different way? So, where are we today? So I would argue that we have a lot of technologies that we see today that are quite reactive in nature. So if you look at something like an Alexa, you ask it a question, it gives you an answer. Most of the time, it's reasonable. On the other hand, if you look at something like location-aware technologies, it's much more proactive. You get in your car, you start driving, it'll tell you something, right? It tells you there's an accident on your way or whatever. You didn't tell it you're in your car. You didn't tell it that you are going to your work. It figured that out. But the only reason it figured that out is because of all of the investment in location-based technologies for a very long time, right? So we know everything about location. So the point that I'm really trying to make here is that if we want to be able to enable all of these examples that I mentioned, we really need to start with, how can we create technologies that understand people at a deep level and very robustly? So everything from what they're doing, who they're with, how they're feeling, what their intents are, what are they trying to do. And we know today that with a lot of sensing information and a lot of AI capabilities and algorithms, we can extract a lot of meaning from that data to enable these understandings. So whether that is an understanding of who the person is, which you might think that that's a solved problem with your phone today, but not in an actual smart environment. So if we start to fuse vision and audio and figure out how do we train these systems more effectively, if we can try to understand what activities people are doing, whether it's in a home for an elderly person or whether it's in a manufacturing facility through vision and audio and all sorts of input about object interactions. If you think about interaction with technology, right? I mean, I just talked about kids. Kids communicate in very different ways. They nod, they laugh, they point, right? And they speak. They don't just speak to an Alexa, right? So how can you actually bring all of these things to enable a much better interaction? And then finally, I would argue that probably one of the most compelling pieces of technology, if we want AI to go into the world, is emotion recognition. Because we absolutely need a back signal to help the AI learn as it goes out into the world. And that cannot happen without the fusion of all sorts of modalities, right? The way you speak, your facial expression, the tone of voice, what you're saying, all of these things go in to make that possible. So I just talked about all sorts of things that touch people in very, very sensitive way. And if we want to build these type of technologies and we want to enable AI to scale, we have to start with building responsible technologies. So, if you think about the notion of creating technologies that can take action, that can decide who's going to get hired and, who's going to get sentenced, which is something that we see today, right? It's absolutely important to be thinking about not just having a deep learning system spit out an answer at us, but it's important to actually tell us what it thinks its certainty level is in that decision. It's important to be able to understand how it came about to that decision. And that means we really need to invest heavily in understanding transparency of AI systems. It's also important that we recognize there is tons of bias in the society today. We saw tons of data today about disparity. That has a lot to do with bias in the society. So we don't want to then take the bias in the society that seeps through the data, that then teaches the AI to be biased and re-amplify that bias. So that's extremely important to actually work on. And finally, I would say privacy has always been a problem, but as you collect all sorts of data, privacy becomes even a bigger problem. So it's very important to be thinking about what is that social contract? What information is needed? Who is it being shared with? So to recap, I think it's time to actually change that narrative, focus on human-AI collaboration, invest in the technologies that will get us there, and make sure that we're doing it responsibly. Thank you.